Hello, welcome to another episode of DecentraLounge, brought to you by Global Stake, your institutional, truly decentralized, self-owned and managed SOC 2 compliant bare metal staking service provider. Today, we're thrilled to have Daniel Hwang, the dynamic CEO and co-founder of Kintsugi Tech, with us. Dan has had a wide and varied career in tech over the last decade, from doing work in bioinformatics and computational biology to performing graduate level research on distributed systems. His overarching interest brought him to the blockchain industry, where he quickly rose to the ranks of various organizations and became a founding member of the Validator Commons, a coalition of validators and allies focused on issues and initiatives that are relevant to the blockchain infrastructure ecosystem. Most recently, Daniel has worked alongside the Alio team to help establish a new strategic approach for decentralizing a successful blockchain ecosystem, which undoubtedly leaned on the years he'd spent researching and thinking about distributed systems. And it is evident that he carries forward this legacy into Kintsugi Technologies, where their work spans both leadership and active core infrastructure development. Dan, we're excited to have you for today's conversation. Let's go all the way back to the beginning and tell us how you originally got interested in the blockchain space. What brought you here?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Ryan. Um, okay, so the very beginning, um, maybe I've already shared this a little bit with you last time, but I was actually not involved in tech at all. Um, my first job out of college, I was working as a paralegal at a corporate law firm, thinking I'd be a lawyer, but I had also studied biology and religion in undergrad. Voodoo actually. It was comparative religions, and then I focused on voodoo for some reason because it was interesting. But um, I mean, I'm Christian, so it was like this power and perspective studies course that just ended up me working a lot with the professor, who was actually a voodoo priestess in Philadelphia. Um, but I think that's kind of relevant because it helped me sort of think outside the box with like looking at things with a different lens. Um, she actually wanted me to become a blogger after I graduated, but good thing I kind of took the wiser out. No, she's great, but but I think, right. Obviously, like I was like, I'm a Christian, but I was studying a lot of like different or sort of like very liberal sort of things and comparative religions in school. But I think that also helped me question a lot of things as well critically. Um, yeah, right out of college, I joined a law firm, Wilmer Hale, and I was thinking I would do like intellectual property stuff and support a lot of lawyers on that side because of my science biology background. But I ended up being sucked into the infamous 2012 congressional hearing against HSBC, where we were defending HSBC. And the TLDR is that HSBC was money laundering or supporting money laundering, helping terrorist financing, and then they got caught, um, which is good. But the bad is that they kind of got away with everything. No one went to jail. They had like a slap on the wrist. And it was so bad that there was like this Netflix documentary that came out years later, in this series called Dirty Money. And so there's an episode on this case. But the fun story is, and the reason I mentioned a bit of the Swarthmore, my undergrad stuff, is that the lead investigator for that case, actually on the permanent subcommittee on investigations, was Senator Carl Levin. So he actually had gone to Swarthmore also, and the interesting thing is I had once been tasked to put together like this black book binder on all the senators that were sitting on the permanent subcommittee on investigations, and he was the last one I had to research, right? And I put all of this information there for all the lawyers to kind of like scrutinize and see how they can like use it to win. And I remember I was like, it was like 11 p.m. or something. I was alone in the law firm war room, just kind of like, feeling shitty, feeling crappy about myself. And I was like, wait a minute. Like, I was already questioning, like, are we the baddies or are we the good guys, right? I mean, there's a whole like spiel about zealous representation that I absolutely think is vital to the importance and upholding of democracy, of objective, right? Like looking at things with an objective lens, and then if you are guilty, then you should be judged equally as someone who is innocent, right? Before you get to that conclusion, which is right, like the reason I mentioned some of the stuff that like being able to look at things from a different lens. But that was not definitely not for me. I kept having like these ideological gut punches and moral or morally ambiguous gut punches when I was working at that law firm, even though I was like the bottom of the ladder there. And so basically, I very conflicted when I was there. And then that was basically that moment. Like I guess you could say like my Tyler Durden moment when I was looking at this guy, Senator, not a guy, like Senator Carl Levin, right? He's one of the guys that was like doing a lot of like the hard hitting stuff after the 2008 financial crisis, right? Like bringing down all these big banks. And he had gone to like my alma mater, Swarthmore College, which was very liberal place, but very politically active, and then also a source of where I drew a lot of my how I looked at the world and how I wanted to participate in the world in terms of how my work and contributed to society. And so it was, yeah, I saw his, I came to him last in the binder when I put together, and then it was like, okay, I'm going to quit. This is enough. Like I do understand the whole zealous representation concept, but like it's definitely not for me. If I was willing to consciously understand, if I was willing to continue to work somewhere where I consciously understood that it was morally conflicting with, right, what we all are able to voluntarily do ourselves in terms of the work we put ourselves into. Yeah, so that's when I left. Very saw everything under the hood for what was going on in these banks, at least with HSBC, and like, and so had a very strong distaste for banks. That's why I sort of call it my Tyler Durden moment. And I left the law firm after that case had finished. There's actually one more that I stayed on because I was sort of feeling loyal to my team. If you remember the JP Morgan whale trades case where that trader in London sort of fat fingered and lost $1 billion. So again, we defended like a bank for losing a lot of customer money. But after that, I left, and then my friend was kind of looking at me when I was complaining to him, and he was like, "Hey, this is around 2013. He's like, hey Daniel, do you know, like I know you hate these banks a lot, and you want to burn them all down, you know, figuratively." Quote me on that. But it was like, there's this thing called Bitcoin, and Bitcoin is going to replace the banks. Like, this is perfect for you, Daniel. Like, we need to start mining this. Like, I'm like, what the hell is mining? And then he and I were the first to like sort of uh, end of 2013. We started like putting together these random milk crates in our, and then like and hosting these mining machines. Um, yeah, that's kind of how I got my start. And then I'll do a really like fast forward, but um, ended up in the Philippines doing relief work, trying to cleanse my soul from a lot of things I thought I did horribly wrong, even though I was like, a grunt soldier, I guess. Um, but I still think that people should take moral responsibility for if what they've done. Right? It's like a Nazi foot soldier, just because you shouldn't justify his actions just because his superior told him to, right? Like, so I think we all sort of, my personal opinion, at least that I held to myself, was like I still felt responsible for contributing to something when I knew it was bad. Um, and so I went to the Philippines. I was doing relief work there for a while. End of 2013, I ended up staying and then building like a small computer lab in this pretty small fishing village called Mangarocoro in the southern Visayan area of the Philippines. Um, Met a kid who wanted to learn math but couldn't go to school. That's why I built the computer lab for him. And then found out a lot of the women were missing from that village because they were working as maids or nannies or whatever, cleaners abroad. And they were getting fleeced on Western Union fees. And I was like, hey, this is exactly like what I'm into. Like, don't use Western Union or banks, so like you can use Bitcoin. And so coincidentally, the computer lab had internet access that I brought in. Um, and then we were trying to do like remittances and stuff like that. Then I came back and realized I needed a job to eat and live. And then that's why I started working at what you and I were talking about earlier, like the bioinformatics lab. Um, uh, and I was doing uh, poop research, which is another term for like gut bacteria research, because we're sequencing poop. And this is actually maybe relevant to later what like that you mentioned earlier, but the interesting part there is that we were using zero knowledge proofs in a sort of fully homomorphic encryption scheme to aggregate a lot of like gut bacteria data from a lot of different labs. Um, and so that was my first interaction with ZK and FHE and stuff like that. This is back in 14, I think. Um, and while I was doing research there, I just decided to get another degree, and that was in computer science. Um, and funny enough, right, one of the co-authors of the Zcash paper, Ian Myers, was at University of Maryland, where I was doing my research when I did my second computer science degree. Um, yeah, and so that is my first introduction to ZK. I ended up working at a pharmaceutical company, and I was leading a permissioned blockchain pilot for ophthalmology supply chain, with the clinical trial supply chain. And Hyperledger Fabric was all the craze. But after I kind of got that taste of ZK and sort of like the crypto world, turns out Matt Green, one of the other co-authors of the Zcash paper, was a professor at Johns Hopkins. And so I'd actually applied there to study there for grad school. So got in, and then I was doing distributed systems research at the Information Security Institute there. And then Matt had advised my thesis, actually on I guess maybe relevant to you guys also, but like on the evolution of consensus mechanisms, which at the time all the rage was Polkadot, right? Like the separation of block finality and block production. And back when Polkadot still had those like fisherman concept, which I was so in love with, I thought it was like the best thing. Unfortunately, I think Polkadot doesn't have that anymore. But so he advised my thesis on that, and and then the spicy stuff happens. But I think you're about to say something. But yeah, like the Polkadot stuff was great. I think it was cool. Yeah.
I just gotta say that is probably one of the most interesting origin stories I think I've ever heard in interviewing anybody.
Burn down the banks. I think that's a pretty common one, right?
Well, no, but just like how you went from like the analogy of your Tyler Durden moment to having your own project Mayhem in a fishing village where you're like building a Bitcoin lab and like getting people to use Bitcoin to like send remittances as they're out in these other islands and stuff. That's just such a cool story. So, and yes, I'm sure we could get like down in the weeds with some of the different consensus mechanisms and everything else. But I mean, it's interesting that even you're like thinking a little bit, and I know we were going to touch a little bit on some of the work you've done with Alio, for instance, but like just the fact that you have had these just interactions with the people who did the paper for Zcash. And one of the things I remember about Zcash was that you had that optionality of whether or not to like share the information that was being broadcast in the transaction or not. And I know that's one of the things, for instance, with Alio is that it's kind of has this like privacy by default, but you can, I think, allow information to go through and otherwise not. And a lot of the
have it transparent. Yeah, like
yeah. So there's a lot of interesting things that is that what was drew you to wanting to work with the team and just kind of help them along in their journey.
Yeah. So 2018, the paper Zero Knowledge Execution came out that a lot of the former Zcash authors, Ian Myers, Matt Green, Chiesa, Howard Wu, who's the co-founder of Alio, Pratyush, had written. That was the first time sort of Matt Green, I was in one of his cryptography classes, and he just like dropped it. He's like, oh, we released this paper, Zero Knowledge Execution. It's like, Zcash plus Ethereum, and then yeah, I Aleo had initially started as a POW type network, and so only last year, early last year, around March, did Aleo transition from POW to POS. Um, One of the coolest things about like the whole Aleo prover, so there's two, right? There's validators in Aleo now with the block production finality, and then there's provers, like miners, like they're doing the POW that are grinding these proofs, which are called Coinbase puzzles to create Coinbase solutions. Um, and one of the coolest things I think is coming for Aleo is something called delegated proving, which is, I think, relevant to sort of the work that we were doing at the Bioinformatics Lab in University of Maryland almost like 10 years ago, where, right, your research lab, you want to do ZK stuff, it takes a while and it costs money, right? So like you have to write a grant and you have to get all this money to like do this. But imagine if there's like this marketplace of people who are already grinding snarks like ZK proofs, and they have the availability to work with research organizations or any other organization that needs like cost efficient proving services. Then you go to them, right? Like it's so cool to be able to see that types of, perhaps, right, the Web3 side is subsidizing hardware costs and accessibility for Web2 and Web3, right? So I think that's like something that's exciting. So Alex Pruden, who's now the executive director of the Aleo Foundation, I so the fun thing is I had first met him. He was the chief strategy officer at Aleo Corporation before they did their split into labs, the core team and the foundation. Um, I had actually interviewed with Aleo, and I was about to be their first hire. It's just like 4 years ago. Um, but then there was like nothing. There's nothing we can do. And like this is literally 4 years later. Aleo finally launched a few weeks ago. But so instead of joining Aleo, I ended up going and working um, in the validator space, which is when I got that direct experience, and then I started helping Aleo transition from POW to POS and contributing to helping develop their validator ecosystem and prover ecosystem. Because now at that point, I had both my POW and POS experience. But yeah, that's sort of the connection. In between, I had led the protocols team at Stakefish, and then I also led the special projects team at F2 Pool, Bitcoin mining pool, or POW mining pool. Before that, which is a much longer story, I used to lead the ecosystem team at Terra. Well, I was only there for 6 months, but then I also rage quit. It was also another Tyler Durden moment, but yeah, there was an undisclosed pre-mine there. No one seemed to give a crap or a hoot, and so I actually resigned immediately. Um, and then everyone said, "Oh, you're so stupid for leaving Terra." It was like shooting up to like 200 whatever dollars, but like, and then obviously it crashed. It died. So it's but what's fair is that I think had I not had the experience of like rage quitting, probably would have been more difficult for me to also rage quit Terra, because it was definitely like a, do you want to be rich or do you want to be right kind of situation. And be right, to be right is doing the right thing. And I think something that's so amazing about that is like after Terra, that's when I joined the validator ecosystem, is that in 2020. But um, there was, had it not been for Terra and seeing what I saw at Terra, I probably would not have been as passionate about the validator ecosystem, because maybe like a story can illustrate this well. Validators knew what was going wrong in the Terra ecosystem. They knew because they're building these blocks and building the code. They can read the code. Like Terra was actually censoring their own block explorer and trying to hide some of these transactions that were happening. Fortunately, there was another validator, Figment, that actually run an external block explorer that we were able to use to confirm that there was censoring going on, which is wild. But validators knew, and there was sort of like this weird, like, the validator ecosystem or the mechanics around it is sort of broken in that validators didn't say anything. They didn't say anything out loud, at least, right? And like you sort of see like validators as being validators in itself, their existence as independent third party organizations are supposed to be this sort of like check and balance against foundations for a decentralized network, right? Like the whole point, and I would argue that the whole point of decentralized blockchains is decentralized infrastructure is the killer use case, right? It is that resilience, that robustness, right? Hopefully censorship resistance, right? Self sovereignty, etc. And that was clearly broken. Um, and so when I left, I was very strongly opinionated on the fact that like validators and infrastructure providers, mind you, like I'd been running Bitcoin nodes and Dogecoin miners and whatever. Um, like obviously POS is much more centralized than POW can be, and there's like gives and takes on both sides, but you have like very clear operators that kind of help manage in a pooling way to manage these ecosystems. But yeah, right. There's like, is a validator going to alert something bad about a chain at the risk of their own rewards that they earn from the chain tanking? Right, it's like shooting yourself in the foot. Right, like, but right, and then some people can argue between like the validator's role and sort of like the quote unquote politics of these networks or governance of these networks, if there is direct on-chain governance, which is like just commoditized sort of block production and transaction verification, like who knows, right? Like, but that's how I sort of got very, very into the validator world, and I still do think that it's a drum that continues to need to be beaten, um, yeah, to death if it needs to, like that the ideologies that we started with that got like everyone's heart pounding and excited like 10 whatever years ago about like, yeah, this the Web3 is cool because like it's going to be disruptive, take out the centralized intermediary censorship resistance, self sovereignty, infrastructure resilient, like that is what like sort of got me excited, and I think got a lot of other people excited, you know um, and I think that continues to need to stay pertinent, um, because without decentralization there's literally nothing. We have just a crappier sort of user experience on a lot of Web3. But and so right, I guess to finish off, like it's uh, that's what I do at Kintsugi. We help plant infrastructure organizations in different countries. I was actually having a talk with Richard from your team also a few weeks ago. But right, it's interesting because you're seeing telecom providers start to run infrastructure. Um, but I think the most important thing is infrastructure needs to be decentralized, not in a geographic way, but more specifically, it needs to be sort of self-sovereign, sovereign. And what I mean by that is that you need to be able to allow, I think, the and for lack of a better word, I think the excuse is that to defend this sort of decentralization of infrastructure, um, you need like at least country specific. This is the way that we try to visualize things and like and operate things to plant these operators in different countries. Is that if you isolate a country, it should be able to build everything from scratch again. You need the operators, the teams, the infrastructure, etc. And so what we try to do, at least with Kintsugi, is we plant local teams that speak the language, that live there, that understand the businesses, that use local infrastructure, that work with those industries. And so I don't know, maybe we'll have 195 validators that represent their countries, and then obviously much more in there. But it's something that I think is a worthwhile pursuit that still gets me excited. Since the first time I sort of, heard about Bitcoin and sort of like decentralization. And yeah, I mean, Kintsugi Tech is just like I guess you could think of it as like training wheels, right? We put training wheels on, we help incubate these teams, and then we take the training wheels off, and then they're like, right, like for example, if we do something in Ethiopia, I'm not Ethiopian, but there's Ethiopian team, Ethiopian DevOps, Ethiopian infrastructure, Ethiopian organization, and that is my hope, um, to see at least, right, decentralization of infrastructure versus, right, as you had mentioned, like the bare metal that you guys are running, right? Cloud is not it. So yeah.
Has there been like a favorite place so far in your early work with Kintsugi, like in terms of just going into certain regions and getting to work with some of these devs who maybe are just beginning their journey? What's that been like?
I think, yeah, maybe it's like a blend of when I was at my previous validator company where I led the protocols team, is that um, that's probably where it sort of planted some of the seeds in me. Um, and I was actually, we were, we, Snakefish, the previous validator, which like all the executives left, but like, including me, but like we were not incubating, we were supporting Tezos bakers in in Kenya. Um, and we were basically sort of, there's a lot of like these independent Tezos baker teams, like these communities that just like popped up. Um, and right, they were using it. I mean, obviously Tezos at the time was a little bit custodial, right? Because the value earn the rewards and then you have to pay them out. But like there are these people, just like these communities that are just popping up that we started supporting, like training, like best practices. Like we had me like just giving talks with a lot of these organizations in Africa, but like it was more of like it was infrastructure and like um, yeah, like it was not just validators for validator's sake, but then they're using it to support a lot of their initiatives and work, etc. Um, so I that's like sort of the first seed that got me excited. The other is that um, actually I almost dropped out of grad school, but while I was in grad school, I had received a grant from Zero X Protocol. If you remember, it's like they were like the decentralized exchange sort of platform that people built, what we used to call relayers and decentralized exchange user interfaces. But it was a grant to sort of focus on hyperlocalization. So like this was to develop relayers that were hyper specific to countries. So I was doing this in Korea and Japan at the time in like 2019, right? It was off the MO of like right, like let's say user compatibility, user experience. Koreans are very comfortable with like seeing websites a specific way, right? And the problems that we still have now existed back then too, right? Like it's too clunky to get users interacting with DeFi. Like I had created this group called DeFi Soul back in the day, where actually we had, if you remember, like BZX and those guys who kept getting hacked, but like DeFi was very clunky back then. But like there was this hyper localization of how people interact with the technology. And so I think like maybe all those are two seeds that sort of helped, kind of all weave this sort of thread of why I think, well, infrastructure needs to be decentralized. I think by geography is helpful because there's a lot of combinations of what you can do with validator operations being a subset of a large organization that can serve, have a very clear focus in serving their country. Because it makes sense then, right? That's the hyperlocalization of, yeah, people who look like you, speak your language, that live there, that go to the every Friday, Thursday happy hour to talk crypto and provide these Web3 organizations and services. They're the ones that hopefully local government will talk to when they need tech questions, right? Like validators understand infrastructure. If you're in a country and that local regulator or whatever standards body needs help, then you're the one that already speaks their language, that lives there, can interact with them, right? That's like sort of how this that dynamic goes. And then again, at the end of the day, like self-sovereignty can happen at the country level too, right? If you cut off, the country should be able to exist on its own. Um, and so I even liken sort of infrastructure self-sufficiency as like a nuclear arms race. I think we see that very clearly with AI, where you literally have countries that are stockpiling like H200, like GPUs, right? Like um, he who has the most GPUs and can run it themselves is like has power. I mean, look at like some countries, like if you have nuclear weapons, you get to stand on your own 2 feet. You don't have to have like some big brother country kind of protecting you. Um, I'm not saying any names, but it's like, right, nuclear weapons give you that self sovereignty on the global stage, and I think infrastructure, at least in blockchain, also can give you a level of self sovereignty as well, of not having to be beholden to or a second class citizen to maybe accessing block space, being able to build things from the ground up by yourself, etc. And so, just like GPUs, right? If you have the most GPUs, you can kind of run your own. Let's say, for example, right, you're a country and you want to support your startup or engineer industry, right? And all the GPUs are in Western Germany somewhere, and you're like in Australia, right? And you need to get your devs access to the latest GPUs so they can do the best so they can compete on the world stage. But right, you're gonna Germany is also trying to do that. They're gonna give their citizens first access to whatever, right? Maybe there's like a little bit of the highest bidder kind of situation, but right, if you have your own, then you can hold your own, hopefully. And so I think it's the same with blockchain infrastructure, Web3 organization, self sovereignty, etc. And so hopefully that can be my contribution to contributing to decentralization before we completely lose sight of it, right? Because at the end of the day, people don't really care. Someone has to care about it, but people are completely content using centralized L2s as long as they get their money, right? But that is not the reason why, right, Bitcoin was created. Right? People were fine using the traditional financial payment methods, right? But
Wow, I just gotta say, Daniel, this took a much more philosophical bent that I did not anticipate in the conversation today, which was great. It was really interesting. And I kept thinking, just hearing about your two rage quits and just your aspirations, all I could think of was admittedly a pun from Omar Little of The Wire, a man got to have a code. And that's certainly
oh
you,
man,
right? Like, I mean, both in terms of like the coding reference, but just like your moral standpoint on a lot of these issues. I'm really envious that I didn't get to go to the thing in Vienna with Rich last year or whenever it was,
yeah,
because I'm
he
sure
came
they
to
would have had
Hokkaido
some
this year. Yeah.
really amazing conversations. Well, for those who've watched the episode, like what's the best way for people to get in touch with you? Maybe some of these devs that are somewhere out in the world and looking for that leadership and looking for an ability to connect with you. Like, what's the best place to get a hold of you, to get in touch with Kintsugi and what you're doing?
We'll find you. No, I'm just kidding. No, you get. I don't know. I'm usually on Twitter, Dan Hwang 88. It's mostly just me ranting, I guess. But I think the most important thing is like maybe like having that perspective or lens of I don't really like to use this word because it seems a little ironic, but like I think if you can, it's there's two words. I think the first is having a sense of, let's say, paternalism to your country, let's say, or your group, to be able to do things yourself and not sort of be beholden to other organizations, right? In the underlying name of like decentralization. So, right, if you're, I don't know, if you're South African, like try to work with other South African builders, use South African infrastructure, help set that up, and sort of be able to bring your ecosystem together. And I think the other thing is maybe a little bit complementary is like agency. Um, I think agency is incredibly important, specifically in decentralized systems of being able to contribute instead of just being told what to do or waiting to be told what to do. And that I think, hopefully, I think fortunately we're seeing more and more in the validator ecosystem, but I think agency in the validator ecosystem is incredibly important. Not just from like validators have to like stab each other in the back and try to stand on their own and try to be global number one, because I don't think that there should be this global number one type of validator role. But yeah, agency and being able to contribute, right? If you are working in these ecosystems or blockchain networks, right? Like, don't be just waiting for that blockchain ecosystem. Like, hey, can you like run RPCs for us or whatever? Like, you should be actively contributing. That is like this purpose of like decentralized systems where there is no central operator. So, agency and paternalism, I think, is two good concepts.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for taking the time to speak with us today, Daniel. For those of you who are watching or listening on Apple or Spotify, anything like that, we will have links to Dan's contact information so you can reach out to him if you'd like to learn more. And as always, thank you for tuning in to watching or listening to today's episode, and we'll see you on the next DecentraLounge next time. Thanks so much, everybody. Take care.
All right.